This year I did the impossible. I actually chipped away at my enormous backlog of video games. 50 games in 50 weeks, and almost entirely first-time playthroughs. Now we are going to rank them from worst to best. Reminder, this is just my opinion, but leave a comment if I need to explain myself a little more for some of the hotter takes on this list. Let's start off with Wario World, a 2003 beat-em-up for the Nintendo GameCube. Wario has his charm, but the levels and the boss fights get really stale really quick. Next up is Final Fantasy I for the NES. The most popular JRPG franchise of all time gets off to a rough start. A far cry from the Super Nintendo era where they finally hit their stride. At 48, I have Castlevania, also for the NES. Another instance of a really iconic, influential game being really dated. Levels are just a bit slow and a little boring. At 47, we have the hottest take on the list, Super Mario 64. Sure, it's in the running for greatest game of all time, but it is also full of boring and sometimes frustrating world layouts and a lot of stars that are just way too easy. At 46, we have Katamari Damacy. The soundtrack on this game is amazing. Unfortunately, rolling around for 10 minutes straight for the 20th time in a row, not so much. At 45, we have Persona 2 Innocent Sin, an SMT-style JRPG that I really wanted to like more. It has a super cool, albeit convoluted storyline, but really the gameplay is simultaneously brain-dead easy and unreasonably complicated in a way that only a game about dating demons could be. At 44, we have Super Monkey Ball. Fun, but so small that it definitely seems more suited to being on an arcade machine rather than trying to pass off as a full home console game. Next up is the first of many Ace Attorney games on this list, Ace Attorney Apollo Justice. Could have been great, but introduces a lot of new, underwhelming mechanics and really interesting plot points that don't get resolved or are even forgotten about by the end of the game. And at 42, we have its sequel, Ace Attorney Dual Destinies. What do you do when you have a main character with multiple unresolved storylines? You introduce two more main characters. And I really like the addition of Phoenix and Athena, just not as much as I would have liked a true Apollo Justice sequel. At 41 is Super Mario Land, randomly a charming, short and sweet Mario game, like Mario 1 but with fighter jets and ancient aliens. Kicking off the top 40, we have Super Mario Land 2, pretty similar to Mario Land 1 but with ties to Super Mario World instead. Pretty fun, especially for a Game Boy game. At 39, we are going back to the Great Ace Attorney Adventures, a really cool premise following Phoenix Wright's ancestor and Sherlock Holmes solving crimes during the 19th century, but it also ends on a pretty shameless cliffhanger. I feel like the game doesn't stand strong on its own without its sequel, Great Ace Attorney Resolve, which I have here at number 38 on the list. It's nice to finally conclude the story, but 2 games is maybe too long for me to get the point across, and for the most part, pretty safe entries in the series. At 37, we have Kirby Nightmare in Dreamland. I originally wanted to play Kirby's Adventure for the NES, but that game is low-key unplayable now because of the lag. Either way, Kirby having copy abilities is fun. At 36 is Super Monkey Ball 2. Monkey Ball finally gets a story mode, and like 100 more levels. Still just a level-based platformer, but with a little more substance this time. At 35, we have Castlevania Aria of Sorrow. This kind of cements to me that I prefer the more fast-paced Metroidvania-style games to the classic Whip games. I did speedrun this game, so I can destroy it, but overall it's still fun. At 34, we have Kirby's Dream Land, the first and most basic Kirby game ever, but it's short and cute and I have big nostalgia for it. At 33, I put Secret of Mana. Early on, I figured out how broken magic was, and I ended up preferring to stunlock every boss rather than running around slashing, but overall, a pretty iconic Super Nintendo RPG. At 32, we have Dragon Quest Monsters, a Dragon Quest-style RPG disguised as a Pokemon game. Dragon Quest Monsters really wants you to use strong monsters, and figuring out which ones to capture and breed is pretty cool. At 31, we have Pokemon Emerald. A lot of the new Pokemon I like have problems like not evolving until the 40s, not learning good moves until the 40s, or not learning any moves at all. But luckily, I found a pretty awesome team of 6, so I had fun. At the number 30 spot, I have Kingdom Hearts. I didn't get the hype until I finally played it for myself. It's definitely a bit dated / basic in terms of visuals and gameplay, but it is such a fun idea to mix Disney and Final Fantasy, and a pretty good series debut. At 29, we have Dragon Quest. Not an early RPG, but the early RPG, and while I ranked its counterpart Final Fantasy really low, this game is still pretty good today. Definitely a must-play for JRPG connoisseurs. At 28, we have Dragon Quest II, a logical next step for the series, introducing a lot of new things like party members and large-scale map exploration that are now staple in most franchises. The most glaring issue in this game is the insane difficulty spike of the final area, but for me, this game is bigger and better in every way. At 27, we have Persona 1. The beginning of the Persona series is less a Persona game and more of an SMT spin-off in both gameplay and tone. A decent first-person dungeon crawler with a story that honestly blew me away. Just keep away from the original US release for PS1 and its infamously bad localization. At 26 is Tales of Symphonia, the first 3D Tales game. Maybe a little long and cheesy for my taste, but a really fun and combo-heavy battle system. Kicking off the upper half of this list, Mario Luigi Brothership. I just released a whole video about this game, so go check that out if you like. Otherwise, this game is a solid revival of the Mario & Luigi series. At 24, we have Dragon Quest IV, a pretty big step up from the previous Dragon Quest games on the list. 8 main characters, all with their own backstories and chapters, and other than Torneko, all super useful and important to beating the game. An honest-to-goodness good RPG. At 23, we have Luigi's Mansion. I could never play this game as a kid since it was a little too scary, and low-key it still is. The booze might be a little tedious to catch if you don't know about L-pumping, but a really cool and unique game, especially for how early it came out in the GameCube's lifespan. At 22, we have the final game of the Apollo Justice trilogy, Ace Attorney Spirits of Justice. A fitting conclusion to the overarching storylines that actually made it to the end. There is still an imbalance between Phoenix, Athena, and Apollo, but the game does remove the problem mechanics of each character, leaving us with just a really good game. Finally, at 21, we have The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, a game that I thought was going to be the biggest disappointment of the year, mostly because it came out right after one of my favorite Zelda games, Wind Waker. It is a bit clunky with the controls and item slots, and the dark vibe isn't really my style, but still a solid 3D Zelda and solid game in its own right. At this point, we are getting into the top 20. The past few games have all been good games, but now we are getting into great territory. These games are all must-plays for their respective consoles, starting with number 20, Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. This is easily the first good Zelda game and kind of serves as what I think a good Zelda game needs to be. Good dungeons, a good supply of items and equipment, and just fun to play / 100%. At 19, we have Super Mario Sunshine, easily the first good 3D Mario game. Sure, it has half the worlds of 64, but the design, themes, and overall vibes of every single area are way cooler, and the missions in this game feel like actual missions to completing a story, rather than just a big collectathon. At 18, we have Ace Attorney Phoenix Wright, a game that had me hooked right out of the gate. The main cast of Phoenix, Mia, Maya, and Edgeworth are all instantly lovable in both design and the story. The mysteries behind the cases were so fulfilling to figure out, and the overarching story between them is pretty amazing. Despite this being a style of game I was hesitant to play, the game was so great that I just had to play through the rest of the series. At 17, we have Ace Attorney Justice for All, which I think is a pretty great sequel to Phoenix Wright, building really well on that game's strengths. The Magatama and Cyclops build on investigation days, Pearl and Franziska are great additions to the cast, and a pretty hot take, the overall case list is better than the first game, with the final case being generally praised as one of, if not the best case in the series. At 16, we have Metroid Fusion, one of the more experimental Metroid games. Coming off what's usually considered to be the greatest Metroid game of all time, Super Metroid, the linearity of Fusion can be a little jarring, but the story's great, the new take on Samus's arsenal is cool, and honestly, when I was playing, it felt nice having some sense of direction rather than just being abandoned on an unmapped planet. Different, but still great. On the other hand, we have Metroid Zero Mission at 15, which is a return to that old open style, but it feels more intentional than ever. This game was meant to be broken. The devs thought of so many ways you might want to sequence break the game, and they said go ahead. The definitive way to play through the original Metroid story, and a victory lap for the Metroid series. At 14, we have Super Mario Party Jamboree. Maybe a little bit of a cop-out putting a straight-up party game on here, but it is pretty much the first Mario Party to do online really well, and has enough content to actually make it worthwhile. I have no idea about anything not related to the Mario Party mode, but classic Mario Party is always fun. At 13, we have Monster Hunter World, the last great Monster Hunter game. Sorry Rise fans, and maybe Wilds fans, depending on how that turns out. I'm a big fan of classic Monster Hunter, and this game kind of perfectly blends that style with the new acrobatic movements and open areas of the new world. You do, however, kind of melt through monsters, especially in multiplayer. This year was also probably the last chance I'll get to play Monster Hunter World, since these games aren't the easiest to go back to, but still a great send-off for a great game. At 12, we have Final Fantasy X. Definitely the most unique entry in the Final Fantasy series at the time. The customization of the Expert Sphere grid, hopefully you're playing on the International or HD release, is one of the best level up systems ever. It's one of the few RPGs at the time where grinding is not the answer to every problem. There were so many fights that felt impossible until I figured out a new build or skill to use, and this problem-solving aspect for battles is pretty amazing. One of the best games in the series, and one of the best RPGs for the PS2. At 11, we have Fire Emblem Awakening, my favorite Fire Emblem game and also the only Fire Emblem game I have ever been able to finish, but there's a really good reason for that. The devs wanted to go out with a bang, making this the most accessible game in the series. Not only did it save Fire Emblem, it made it into the Nintendo powerhouse it is today. Partnering troops helped the action and pacing of the battles. Romance, i.e. shipping wars, were introduced. I got lucky since my favorite characters all kind of paired up perfectly with each other, although I'm pretty sure Chrom and specifically male Robin is the best ship in the entire series. A last hurrah turned revival turned great game. At 10, we have Persona 2 Eternal Punishment, the last of the SMT style Persona games and definitely the best. Eternal Punishment pretty much perfects everything Innocent Sin tried to do, while still staying true to that original style. Good battle system, great cast, and even greater story. There is also the perfect amount of callbacks to the previous stories and characters from Persona 1 and Innocent Sin. It just perfectly wraps up that weird world of Persona 1 and 2, while at the same time being a one-of-a-kind experience. Also, the demon dating is just a little bit less impossible this time around. Finally, at number 9, we have Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga. Before my career of speedrunning and making videos on this game, Superstar Saga was, and always will be, just a great game. Fast-paced and quirky story, while dodging and countering enemies is probably the best defense of all Mario RPGs. I do prefer the original game to its 3DS remake, which fixes some design and balancing issues, making it what probably should be considered the definitive version, but whichever way you want to play will be a fun time, and I just wish there was more to the story so I can keep playing more of the game. I am excited to have made it this far in the video. The remaining games on this list are more than just my favorite games of the year, but genuinely some of the best experiences I have ever had playing video games. If I were to go back in time and grow up all over again, I would have to make absolutely sure to experience these games at least once in my life. So without further ado, these are my top 8 games of 2024. Dragon Quest VIII Journey of the Cursed King marks the modernization of the Dragon Quest series, not just with the switch to 3D graphics and voice-acted cutscenes, but also with the introduction of now series-stable mechanics like skill points, alchemy, and high tension. This was also the first game in America to finally be labeled as Dragon Quest instead of Dragon Warrior, and I think kids my age were starting to connect the dots, like, oh my god, these guys look like Goku and Trunks, and they go Super Saiyan, that's so cool! Dragon Quest VIII is a fan favorite, and it's surprising a game can be so good and iconic and is getting that kind of praise 8 games deep into such an influential series. I give credit to Dragon Quest's willingness to stick to its roots while adapting to the ever-changing RPG landscape. For example, this is one of the least grindy games in the series, thanks in part to all of those new mechanics mentioned earlier, but it is still a Dragon Quest game in every single way. The story and world feels maybe a bit small compared to the other Dragon Quest titles, focusing on the journey of the Cursed King, trying to break the spell on him and the princess, but it of course opens up as you play. Top that off with some cool post-game lore and Easter eggs, leading to my favorite and true ending of the game, make it the best classic-style RPG of the generation. Trials and Tribulations is widely considered the best game in the Phoenix Wright trilogy, and the best game in the Ace Attorney series, and I couldn't agree more. It's the culmination of so many years of hard work, and such a perfect payoff for sticking through this 3-game series of mystery, excitement, and adventure. Trials and Tribulations is the cleanest gameplay experience of the trilogy, refining the existing gameplay mechanics of the prequels. The cases themselves are the most consistently great cases in the entire series and introduce new ways of playing, jumping around different times and different characters' POVs throughout. The story is more than perfect. It's the final conclusion to Phoenix's arc becoming a great defense attorney, but also finishes building on his backstory and his relationships with the entire cast. This is very much a Phoenix Wright game, but it does a perfect job connecting and wrapping up the multi-game, overarching storylines for every character in the main cast from across every single game of the trilogy. Mia, Maya, Edgeworth, Pearl, Franziska all play important roles throughout the game, and even the newly introduced fan-favorite prosecutor Godot has a perfect one-game character arc. I cannot think of a single stone left unturned. Is it the greatest visual novel ever? While the series has mostly fallen behind Final Fantasy in terms of popularity today, I think Dragon Quest, and more specifically Dragon Quest III, really epitomizes what it means to be a great JRPG. Even as new innovations were being made by many soon-to-be iconic series, Dragon Quest III sort of doubled down on that classic style, while at the same time innovating it more than ever before. The world and the plot lines are bigger and better than ever, but the biggest addition to the game is of course the fully customizable party and job system. Whether you like to mix and match throughout the story, or stick with one or two different job progressions for each playthrough, the fact that something like this existed and was this great in 1988 is actually crazy to think about. And it doesn't just hold up by today's standards. I'm genuinely struggling to think of a game that far surpasses the vocation system, other than maybe a game higher on this list. All of that combined with the surprisingly personal story of searching for your missing father, and the most unkept secret in gaming history being that this game is the prequel to the original Dragon Quest story, makes it a must-play. Not only the first great JRPG, but quite possibly the greatest JRPG of all time. My pick for Best New Game of 2024 and Best Soundtrack of the Year. Persona 3 Reload is 100% the definitive way to play Persona 3. I was hesitant to get into the series at first because I'm not the biggest fan of missing out when it comes to things like choosing between this item or this cutscene, or dating this girl instead of the other. I want them all. So things like Social Link, the calendar, were scary going into it, but I fell in love 4, 5, 6 times coming out. Making those tough decisions and living with the consequences is just a theme of the game, a theme of life really. But I still pulled it off. The story is so dark and so beautiful, and every song just sets the mood so well, whether you're fighting to save the world or grabbing lunch with the best girl. I won't say who, but damn, this soundtrack is so good. But most of all, I was surprised at how well this game played. One of the biggest things holding back the early Persona games was the actual Persona system itself. But now you can easily recruit and customize personas with every battle. There is an afterstory with episode Aegis, but I already think base game has one of the greatest endings ever. Everything about Reload is just so clean and streamlined. It is Persona perfected. It's showtime, girls. I'm pretty sure 10-2 will go down as my favorite Final Fantasy game of all time. If you know anything about this game, it's probably just the intro scene. Yes, there is singing and dancing, and yes, it's awesome, but don't let these moves fool you. This game has one of the best battle systems ever. Timing is everything, and trying to chain your attacks and dress spears and disrupts while also managing the timing of enemies that can do the same right back at you is way more involved than any other JRPG. But 10-2 is more than just the battles. It's the story, and the characters, and I love it all. Yuna, Riku, Pain, and the entire cast of Gullwings are super cool and fun to hang out with, in part because they have fun hanging out with each other. I feel like that kind of dynamic is a breath of fresh air compared to the Chosen Heroes Fated Journey type cast that's so common everywhere. 10-2's plot is still urgent and threatening and makes sense to the lore without stepping on the original. and Spira's glow up through all the events of the past 2 years means so much more to me, because after everything that's happened, I see it was all worth it. An equally silly and epic adventure that was so fun, it was the only game I just had to play through multiple times this year. Okami is the best looking Zelda game of all time. All jokes aside, yes, this is a game very similar in design to 3D Zelda, but it is by no means a 3D Zelda clone. Aside from the obvious, being a dog, having a jump button, what really separates this game from the crowd is the Celestial Brush, which is the most unique and most perfectly utilized game mechanic ever invented. Drawing is so intuitive and is surprisingly responsive, and in a game as fast-paced as this, the quick and almost seamless transition in and out of the brush menu makes the action feel non-stop. Programming an action game with a dog as the main character sounds difficult right off the bat, but controlling Ami, jumping, platforming, and fighting feels so right. It was pretty jarring to go from this game to a game like Twilight Princess that is so similar in design and even came out later than Okami, but feels so clunky in contrast. Finally, the watercolor ink wash art style of Okami is of course beautiful, but also perfectly complements to the setting and stories steeped in old Japanese folklore. Okami got my first 10 out of 10 score of the year, and while you don't necessarily need to be perfect to get that kind of score, Okami, more than anything else on this list, really feels like a flawless game. Here we are, my childhood favorite GameCube game. And what is there to say about Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door that hasn't been said already? It's an absolute classic, the epitome of Mario RPG gameplay, has an iconic soundtrack and a timeless art style that didn't really need the visual update if you ask me. But more so than any game ever, I can pick up Thousand-Year Door, play through it start to finish, anytime, anywhere, and still have as much fun as I did playing through it the first time. Yes, looking back, there were definitely flaws with the game that I, as a super fan, overlooked. But after playing the 2024 remake, pretty much any problem with the original game was fixed. Every instance of backtracking was improved, especially the dreaded General White Hunt of Chapter 7. But even if that weren't the case, I would still love this game. I will say, I am a bit biased towards the original GameCube visuals, frame rate, and soundtrack, but the remake is still great. Whether it was the new bonus content or the more subtle changes, like giving each chapter and character their own versions of the Reunion soundtrack, my favorite video game song ever. It really made my 100th time playing through this game feel more special than ever. T2ID will forever and always be one of my favorite games of all time. At the beginning of this year, if you told me I would love a game as much as I loved Kingdom Hearts 2, I would not believe you, and yet here we are today. It's hard to pinpoint what my favorite part of this game is, because pretty much everything is that good. It obviously builds off of Kingdom Hearts 1, but this time it's done so perfectly. The selection of Disney worlds mesh really well with the more Final Fantasy half of the game. The new combat with reworks to magic, reaction commands, drive forms, and especially Critical Mode, the best difficulty setting of all time, and the whole reason I specify Final Mix for this game, make it the best combat in any video game I've ever played. Kingdom Hearts 2 introduced so much cool ass shit. Roxas, who's a badass. Organization 13, badass. Mickey Mouse, with the dark cloak? That shit's badass. Seeing the kids from Kingdom Hearts 1 growing up is also really great. Riku completing his redemption arc, and Kairi getting an actual storyline felt so right. And Sora becoming even more of a wholesome yet badass hero was crazy. I mean, when he started throwing skyscrapers around, that was it. Having them finally reunite is the perfect conclusion to such a cool and unique series of games, and the perfect conclusion to my top 50 games list of 2024. Thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you again next year.